7 years ago, my wife and I bought a house tucked deep in the woods of northeastern Minnesota. A quiet 11-acre stretch of property that felt like our dream home. The woods on our land merged with a far larger section of forest and farmland, roughly 160 acres of mixed terrain. And though the region is rural, it's not completely isolated. We're about 10 minutes from a state highway, and the nearest town is maybe a 15-minute drive. A few housing developments sit 3 or 4 miles off, but otherwise it's a patchwork of open fields, creeks, and thick wood in every direction. Remote, yes, but not untouched northern wilderness that stretches endlessly towards Canada. I mention that because most of the stories people tell about strange creatures in Minnesota always point to the far north, the true wilderness. I'd heard of native legends and tales of spirits and beasts in the deep pines, but those always seemed like folklore tied to places far from here. This wasn't that. This was settled land, farmland, logging country, not the middle of nowhere. What you should know about me is I've never been a superstitious man. I'm a hunter, a climber, and I've spent more nights alone in the backcountry than I can count. I know the sounds of the forest. I know the difference between fear and instinct. I'm not the kind of guy who startles easily. Bears, wolves, moose, I respect them, but I don't scare easy. My whole life, I've prided myself on that. At least I used to. When we first moved in, the property had been sitting empty for a couple of years after foreclosure, and it showed. The house needed a ton of work. The land was overgrown. Wildlife had completely reclaimed the area. It was common to see black bears wandering through the yard at night, even in broad daylight. There were deer, raccoons, foxes, owls, coyotes. Every species in the area seemed to use our yard like a rest stop. We found animal bones all over, scattered in the woods, near the edge of the swamp, sometimes right by the property line. It was unsettling, yeah, but I figured that's what happens when humans leave an area alone. But then came the first real scare. A few weeks after we'd settled in, a heavy rainstorm rolled through late one night. Around 10, I realized one of the downspouts behind the house had cracked, and I didn't want the basement flooding. So I threw on my boots, grabbed my headlamp, and went out into the rain to fix it. Behind our house lies a swampy patch that runs the width of the property and separates our land from the deeper woods beyond. It's a murky wetland, thick with cattails and reeds. While I was working on the downspout with my back to that swamp, I suddenly felt wrong. It's actually hard to put into words. It's like an electric dread that started in my spine and spread to every part of me. Not the regular something's out there feeling. This was worse. My instincts were screaming that I was not alone. Slowly, I turned, aiming the beam of my headlamp towards the swamp. That's when I saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them. Reflections scattered across the dark like embers. They were all different heights. Some low to the ground, others far higher than any deer or coyote could reach. At first, I thought it was just a trick of light, maybe rain droplets catching the beam. But when I turned my headlamp directly at the spots, there was nothing. Just grass, water, trees. When I shut the light off, the eyes were still there, glowing softly, staring right through me, it felt like the light was inside them, like whatever eyes were out there were self-illuminating. They didn't blink or even move. They just watched me. Every bit of calm, logic, every bit of reasoning just vanished. I ran, full sprint, back to the house, slamming the door behind me, breathing like I just finished a marathon. My wife asked me what was wrong, but I brushed it off. Told her there were some animals out there, anything but what I'd really seen. Weeks passed and I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Then summer came, and the nights grew warm. One evening around 11, I was out on our screened porch overlooking the swamp. The air was still, no wind, just the hum of frogs and insects, when I heard something that made my skin crawl. It sounded like a bear attacking a cow or something close to it. The roar that started it was deep, guttural, full of rage. Then came another sound layered beneath it, something like the desperate bawl of a cow in pain. The noises echoed from the south, near the stretch of woods where a small farm sat beyond my property line. My first thought was that maybe one of their cows had gotten loose and was being mauled by a bear. I didn't know if bears actually did that, but it was the only explanation that fit. The sounds went on for over an hour, screaming, crashing, growling, low roars that didn't quite sound like an animal. It was horrible, and I felt bad for whatever was out there getting ripped apart, but because I could explain it away, it didn't scare me. At least, not yet. When it happened again the following summer, same time of night, same direction, I started to wonder. At the time, that part of the woods wasn't mine, but 2 years later I got the chance to buy 70 acres adjoining our land, the same area those noises had come from. The new property had woods, a few open fields, and some low-lying ponds. While exploring, I finally got a good look at the farm to the south. They did have cattle, yes, but their fenced pasture was way too far away for me to have heard them like that. The fencing was solid, electrified, and well maintained. There was no way a cow had wandered into those woods. And that realization sat heavy with me. After the purchase, I spent a lot of time walking the new acreage to get familiar with it. I put up deer stands and trail cameras in likely spots to prep for hunting season. One camera went right through those strange woods near the swamp, the same area the sounds had come from years earlier. That's when I started noticing how off the place felt. Every time I hiked there, I found something strange, something new. Once, my son and I discovered an old game snare tied high around a tree. The metal stained dark, like it had once held something that was bleeding. Another time, we came across a massive tree. Had to be over a century old. It had barbed wire fence wrapped around it so deep the trunk had swallowed the metal entirely, and it was curling around it like scar tissue. There were tree trunks with claw marks, long, deep, and far too wide for a deer to rub. Maybe a huge bear, I told myself, but the claw spacing didn't make any sense. And there were bones, always bones. Deer legs, half-buried rib cages, skulls, sometimes freshly picked clean, sometimes long weathered. Even this last winter, I found 2 deer legs near a clearing, snapped in half and gnawed to the bone. My sons have found dozens of skulls back there over the years. It's like that patch of forest collects the dead. Despite the abundance of signs, the trail camera I set up never captured anything. Not a raccoon, not a deer, not even a stray bird. Every other camera on the property picks up constant movement, but that one? Nothing, just dead air. When my son hunted from that stand, he always mentioned the silence. He said it was eerie how the woods would go completely quiet. There weren't crickets or frogs, nothing. Then, out of nowhere, everything would start again, loud and chaotic, like something had passed through and the forest didn't want it to be heard. He's heard footsteps out there too, slow crunches in the leaves circling the stand, but he's never seen the source. A couple of years back, he went out looking for me while I was cutting brush on the far side of the property. As he hiked through the same area, he thought he spotted me ahead. There was a tall figure walking quickly through the trees. He almost called out until he realized the clothes were all wrong. Whoever it was, they weren't wearing what I had on. He said the figure didn't notice him at all, just kept walking in a straight, unwavering line deeper into the woods, right towards a section that only leads into steep ravines and an impassable river. There's no trail out there, no reason for anyone to be moving in that direction. He found me half an hour later, told me what he'd seen, and we went to investigate. We searched the area thoroughly. There was no sign of anyone. No footprints or tire tracks, no litter. That same year, my son and one of his friends went walking near dusk. They were cutting across the field that borders those woods when they noticed a shape standing between the trees. It was tall and thin and motioning with its hands as though gesturing for attention. They called out, "Hey, you okay?" But the figure didn't answer back. It simply turned and began walking toward them, slow, almost floating. That was all it took. They bolted. They came crashing into the house, out of breath, pale faces, huge eyes. They both talked over each other, trying to describe what they saw. I laughed at first, told them they were letting their imaginations run wild, but the more I listened, the less I laughed. They described a figure around 10 to 15 feet tall, impossibly thin, its body covered in dark, scruffy hair. The arms were long, the limbs were bent strangely, and its head had pointed, upright ears like a German shepherd's. They said it moved in jerky, uneven strides, not quite human, not quite animal, but definitely something that was in between. I was worried it could be a trespasser, or someone dangerous. I grabbed my coat and the flashlight and went out immediately. There was fresh snow on the ground, so I expected the tracks to be clear, but when I reached the spot they described, there was nothing. No prints or broken branches, no signs of movement at all. If it had been a normal animal or a man, there would have been evidence, but there was none. To this day, my son swears he saw it. His friend, too. Their terror that night wasn't an act. I've never seen 2 kids that shaken in my life. And my wife, she's had her own experiences as well. She's heard strange crashing in that same part of the woods, like heavy footsteps, breaking branches, then silence. She says sometimes she feels watched when she's outside hanging laundry or gardening, and she refuses to walk back toward the swamp alone anymore. When I lay everything out chronologically, the glowing eyes, the screams, the bones, the silence, the figure, it all points back to the same patch of land. That one section of woods near the swamp where the trees stand empty and the cameras never catch anything. I've spent the better part of a year trying to reason it out. Maybe there's a sinkhole that releases gases that makes animals act strange. Maybe it's just coincidence, a cluster of weird events. But the more I piece it together, the less sense it makes. It's not something I talk about with the locals. You start bringing up glowing eyes and 10-foot shapes, and people stop making eye contact at the feed store. So I've kept it to myself, mostly. But lately I've been looking into similar reports online, and that's when I came across stories of something called the Dogman. Some of it fits: the height, the canine head, the strange silence that precedes its appearance, and of course the feeling of being watched. And then there's the way the wildlife disappears when it's around, like it's feeding on them. But other parts don't line up at all. The eyes I saw weren't reflective like an animal's. They glowed on their own. But then again, some reports that I read about the Dogman, their eyes do the same thing. Whatever it was that made those noises years ago sounded big, mean, and feral, which again fits the Dogman's description. All I can say is this: there's something in those woods. It's been there for years. It's quiet, patient, and territorial, and it's very good at hiding. And whatever it is, it doesn't behave like any animal that I've ever known. I've stopped going near that area at night. I don't let my kids hike there alone. The trail camera still stays up, still records nothing, and somehow that's the part that unnerves me the most. What if this thing is just that good at eluding people? What if it's intelligent enough to stay away from cameras and people when it can be seen? Sometimes when I'm out chopping wood and I feel that familiar prickle on my back, the same one that I felt that rainy night behind the house, I can almost sense it watching me from the swamp. Not close enough for me to see, but close enough for it to watch me. Just close enough to remind me that it hasn't left. Maybe someday I'll get proof of what's really out there. But deep down, I already believe I have. I've lived in Freiburg most of my life, a city folded neatly against the edge of the Schwarzwald. It's beautiful in a way that sneaks up on you. Slate roofs and church spires, trams humming through tidy streets, and then, step east, dark firs shouldering the horizon like a wall. Growing up, I heard all the old lore you can avoid if you live here. Dwarves with sticky fingers for glass beads, wandering spirits that drift at the tree line, glassmakers who know more about flames than fire should allow. They were charming to me, like bedtime stories that throw a shadow on the ceiling and then dissolve by morning. That easy disbelief held until I had reason to question it. I work as a freelance photographer, mostly nature spreads for travel magazines, hiking guides, tourism boards, the usual suspects. It's a good life if you can stand long days, heavier than smart backpacks, and the permanent perfume of damp wool. My office is a trailhead. My desk is a mossy log. I walk a lot, wait a lot, hope the light does what I want before my hands freeze off. The Black Forest is one of my favorite haunts to shoot. I've always liked its temperament. Those dense, resin-scented trees. The way mist knits itself low along the ground in October. People call it eerie. I find it oddly soothing. A cathedral with needles for stained glass. A hiking magazine commissioned a feature on the paths less traveled. It was all about hidden routes for experienced walkers who don't mind losing a phone signal along with the crowds. It was exactly the sort of thing I enjoyed. Tricky footing, solitude, and the chance to point a lens at scenes most visitors never see. I mapped a 3-day loop, planned an overnight in a remote area, and blocked out shot list. Autumn canopy, stream crossings, old stumps feathered with fungus, and a waterfall just off the main ridge. My usual hiking partner, Marcus, bailed the night before. "Sorry, mate," he said, voice thick with apology. "The boys got the flu. You going to be all right on your own?" "I'll be fine," I told him. 2 nights, I'll stick to the route, check in if the signal gods are kind. I set off early on a Tuesday in late October. Fog lay over Freiburg like a folded blanket as I drove east, headlights pushing tunnels through the gray. By the time I parked the trailhead, the clouds had thinned into threads. The air had that pine and leaf smell you only get when the forest is damp but not wet. I shouldered my pack, camera bodies wrapped in cloth, 2 fast primes, a 7200, spare batteries, a battered tripod, then tightened my laces and slipped under the trees. Day 1 felt like a gift. I covered about 20 kilometers on a lesser marked trail that tugged and twisted through beech and spruce. The colors were out in force, the beeches flaring to rust and red, the firs holding that deep, serious green that makes everything else look like it's showing off. I shot a stand of mushrooms lit like tiny lamps. I waist-deep waded in the bergbach to get a better angle of a waterfall. It was swollen with recent rain, white water exploding into spray. If damp socks are the price, so be it. I reached the first hut near dusk. It was as advertised. Plain, functional, smelling faintly of old wood smoke. 4 bunks, a table, a simple stove, a shelf of mismatched mugs, and a guest book a decade thick with polite notes and terrible sketches. The forecast had threatened a spell of showers. I could hear the wind bit by bit shouldering into the trees outside. That slow, low hush like fabric being dragged over gravel. And then, sound threaded through it, but it was different. A long, deliberate howl rolling across the trees. Wolves, you're thinking. Fair. They've got to be trickling back into Germany for years. But I've spent a lot of nights out here and never heard one in person. The sound put a cold line down my spine. I told myself wind does odd things in the forest, bending and binding until it sounds intentional. I told myself, lucky you, finally hearing a wolf like everyone says is possible now. A few minutes later it came again, but closer and longer, like a voice choosing a note. I locked the hut door, sensible, if not exactly ballistic grade, and I made a half-hearted dinner of bread and cheese. Every small noise snagged me, a knot in the rafters popping, the stove ticking as it cooled, the occasional patter of something brushing the wall outside. I've spent lonely nights in worse places and slept soundly. This time, consciousness clung to me like a wet shirt. Still, dawn always breaks, and when it did, the forest sounded ordinary again. Robins, titmice, a jay scolding something invisible. In daylight, last night's fear looked flimsy, like a stage you set when you can see on ropes. I packed my kit and moved on, determined to get the work done. My route that day stitched together faint paths, overgrown connectors, and stretches that barely qualified as trails at all. Perfect for the piece. Buried waymarkers, knee-high bracken, saplings reclaiming old forest cuts. But as the hours went by, another thing crept in. An attention that wasn't mine. The feeling is familiar to anyone who's done time in quiet places. Hair prickles, shoulders tightening. You realize you've been walking with your jaw clenched. When I turned to stare down the path behind me, there was nothing except light falling through branches, and yet the sense of being bracketed, observed, simply persisted. I tried to throw myself at the job, meter for the shadows, watch for the shafts of light, work a composition until the frame stopped lying. But I caught myself checking over my shoulder so often it became farce. The forest felt darker than it should have at that hour, as if the space between trees had thickened. At one point, something shifted just at the margin of my vision, like a shape stepping aside. And when I pivoted, it was all trunks and needles and the bladder of light caught in a fog. Nothing there. Nothing at all. By late afternoon, I was flirting with cutting the trip short. The unease had matured into something that sat in my chest, heavy and decided. And now there were sounds. Twig snapping where I hadn't stepped. Fern fronds brushing back against the shape that I couldn't see. Soft footfalls that always took themselves one tree further than I could sight. I pulled out my phone. Thumbed at the bars out of habit. No service, of course. And yet, I pushed on. The second hut was closer than my car, and the stubbornness can be a religion if you let it. The path fell to a shallow stream and followed it. Clear water over stones, the color of old coins. The hut sat beyond the bend, smaller than the first, tilting slightly, as if the ground under it had exhaled too hard. I heard a splash upstream and looked up, assuming a deer crossing, maybe a boar. What stood in the channel 20 meters away did not belong to any list that I keep. At a glance, a man. Tall, broad through the shoulders, upright. Then the lens inside my head racked focus, and the human proposition dissolved. Thick, dark coat, matted from water. Limbs too long for our kind. A head that carried a snout. No other honest name for it. Full of teeth not meant for herbivores or polite company. Ears canted forward. The eyes caught the last wash of light and held it in amber. It was looking at me, not through me or past me, directly at me. For what I saw looked exactly like a werewolf. I didn't move. I couldn't even breathe. The stream burbled, as if a stagehand had forgotten to kill the sound. Then it lifted its head. The throat worked. And the same long howl I'd heard the night before uncoiled into the evening like a blade drawn slow. I ran. I didn't frame the shot of the century. Instinct shouldered everything else off of the staircase. I left my pack where it was and hammered through the undergrowth, hips slamming branches, boots slipping on leaf-slick roots. Breath turned to fire. The world narrowed to the next footfall and the one after that. It is possible your mind throws sounds behind you when fear takes the wheel. It is also possible that the heavy measured steps I heard were not imagined at all. Weight hitting earth, branches snapping under something that wasn't troubled by speed. I have no timing for what came next. It was both one long moment and 100 stitched together. When I burst out onto the main hiking path, I nearly collided with two men in soft-shell jackets, the kind of prepared that carries first aid kits and snacks for strangers. "Whoa, are you all right?" the bigger one asked, hands out, not touching me but anchoring me back into my body. "A wolf," I gasped, "down by the stream. Not a normal one." They exchanged a look. The kind strangers give each other when they're measuring whether to humor you or call you someone with a clipboard. "A wolf? Here?" the second man said. "Maybe a big dog. There's a village not too far." I pointed, words falling over each other. Whether it was pity or curiosity, they agreed to look. I waited by the junction, gulping air and trying not to watch the trees. They were back within minutes, shrugging. "Nothing there, friend," the big one said gently. "Are you sure you're okay? We can drive you back to Freeburg." I must have looked wrecked, or foolish, or both. They kept insisting, and I stopped resisting because I had no appetite for another night alone out there. They likely filed me under city man with imagination, or panic, or both. I didn't correct them. I didn't have language I trusted. 2 days passed before I could persuade myself to retrieve my gear. This time I brought Marcus, who had the decency not to tell me I'd lost my mind before we set off. We waited for full daylight and clear weather. We hiked in quietly, a kind of truce between us where neither would tease the other until we were safely home. My backpack lay exactly where I dropped it, half slumped, a damp shoulder strap stuck to a rock. My lenses were fine. The body had scuffed the way gear does when you treat it like gear. We swept the area. There weren't any tracks, no fresh scat, no fur snagged on a thorn, no churned mud where something heavy had turned, and definitely no sign of a werewolf. The stream was as blank and bright as if it had been scrubbed. "You sure you didn't spook yourself, mate?" Marcus asked as we headed back. "This place is creepy when you're alone. It plays with your head." I nodded because arguing wouldn't invite anything I wanted to meet. Sometimes silence is the only boundary you have. Now, still years later, I live here. I still shoot the forest, but I don't go in alone anymore. Not beyond the broad, well-loved paths. Not when the light is thin and the mist is building. In town, habit has changed me in smaller ways. Windows locked even on breezy evenings. Door chains slipped on without thinking. A glance at a tree line when the trams are quiet and the air tastes of rain. Some nights I tell myself it was shadow work. The eye's old trick of finishing shapes it only half sees. Branches line up, fog breathes. A deer lifts its head at just the wrong angle, and suddenly you're carving a wolfman out of vapor. I want that to be true. I want it so much to be true that I practice believing it. But when I remember the voice of that howl, not ghost noise, not wind caught and taught to mimic an animal. A chosen note, a statement. Call it a werewolf if you like. Call it something that's been here longer than our maps. I can't give you a photograph to settle the argument. All I can tell you is this. In a stream bend of the Black Forest, as dusk slid its hands into the trees, something stood on two legs and looked right at me. And those old legends are true. And I ran, because that was the only honest thing left to do. I grew up in Salt Lake City, where wildlife meant a deer cutting across a quiet street or a raccoon tipping a trash can over. Sure, the mountains had their bears and the odd mountain lion, but those felt like tornadoes or hurricanes, hazards that belonged to other people somewhere far away. That changed in 2007. Moved our crew to what the realtor optimistically labeled a mini rural community about 40 minutes outside the city. With 3 kids under 10, we'd outgrown our little starter place, and the land was cheaper out there. The thought of giving the kids room to run had its pull for a pair of ex-city folk. We weren't ranchers by any stretch, but we loved the quiet, and the way the stars actually showed their faces once you got out there. Now, I won't name the town. It wasn't much of a town anyway, more of a scatter of houses and a few small farms, and of course the occasional business strung along curling roads. There weren't real borders, just the local rule that once you passed the old grain silo on Route 16, you were in. Our nearest neighbors lived a quarter-mile away, which took some getting used to after city blocks and shared fences. The trouble kicked off late in 2009, roughly 2 years after we'd settled. My cousin lived about a mile down the road. That had been part of the draw when we chose this area. One morning he called, voice shaky. "You haven't seen Bruno, have you?" Bruno was their Great Dane. Massive, soft-hearted, basically a fourth kid. "No, man, did he get out?" My cousin went quiet long enough to twist my stomach. "I'm hoping what I found isn't the rest of him." "Good Lord, the rest of him? What happened?" I asked. "We found him this morning. Part of him, anyway. Something got him last night." I drove over immediately. He was out back, shovel in hand, digging a grave that looked far too small for a dog like Bruno. A tarp lay nearby, and the sight of it explained everything. There wasn't much left to bury. A sheriff's deputy came and chalked it up to a mountain lion. They'd been showing up more often. He said as development pushed into their range, they were more common. On paper it made sense, but I couldn't shake how odd it seemed for a lion to take a 150-pound dog. Ambush cats pick easy meals when they can. We adjusted. Max and Cooper, our two labs, stayed in a fenced yard by day and indoors after dark. The kids got strict instructions to leave the woods behind the house alone unless one of us was with them. A couple of months passed without any problem. But then in January, the Souls, an older couple up the hill, salt-of-the-earth folk who'd farmed those slopes their whole lives, lost a cat. It was their orange tabby, and he was found scattered in the front yard. Awful, of course, but not unheard of in country like this. But then less than a week later, it happened again. Another cat, torn apart under the almost same exact circumstances. 2 in a week sounded like brutal luck, but most folks still muttered mountain lion or bear and carried on. One thing that nagged at me: whatever was taking pets didn't touch livestock. The Sewells had goats and chickens. Other neighbors kept a small herd of cattle. Not one farm animal was lost, only our pets. I mentioned that to Carrie after bedtime. Isn't it strange? If it's a lion, why only the cats and dogs? She shrugged and said maybe they're easier to grab. Maybe they wander farther than the stock. Again, something like this sounded reasonable, so I let it go. Until a night in early March when someone started pounding on our front door around 10. Now what you gotta know is people around here don't show up unannounced at that hour of the night. I checked the peephole and saw Mr. Sue on the porch, looking worn down. We'd only exchanged waves and the occasional hello at the pancake breakfast since we moved in. I greeted him and asked if everything was okay. He kind of glanced past me, real jittery-like, and asked if my family was asleep. I told him the kids were, but my wife was reading, and asked what was going on. "Do you mind if we step outside? I need a word," he asked. It was biting cold outside, but I followed him onto the porch anyway. He took off his cap, rubbing a hand through thinning gray hair. He looked like a man exhausted. Dark circles, heavy eyelids. And he said, "What I'm about to say stays between us. I'm only telling the men with families in the hollow." I nodded, feeling my own nerves wind tight. What in the hell could he be talking about? He said, "Last night, I took Scraps out to the goat late. 11:30 maybe. Martha had already turned in. I'm spreading the scraps, and I hear breathing. Deep, heavy, like something big trying to be quiet. I think maybe a goat's sick, but they're all bunched at the far side of the pen. There's something else in the corner, big as a bear, maybe bigger, hunched over. I can't make out a shape, just all fur and bulk. And the goats? Not a peep. Not scared, just standing there like it belonged with them." The hair on my neck rose. "I ran for my rifle," he went on, "but when I got back it was gone. This morning, we found Lily, our last cat, by the pen. Or what was left." "I'm sorry," I said. "That's not the worst of it," he said, lowering his voice. "We locked up tight that night, been keeping the cat in after losing the first 2. But I forgot to lock one window, the laundry room crank. This morning it was open a few inches. You know the type. locked and you can't turn it from the outside. But something had cranked it open from out there. Do you think whatever killed your cats tried to come in, I asked? The thought made my stomach drop. I think it tried, he said. Maybe it coaxed Lily out. Maybe she slipped through. Either way, it wasn't the wind. I wanted to warn you. We're talking about organizing a hunt. Till then, lock everything in after dark. After that, I tightened the routine again. The dogs stayed inside unless one of us watched them. The kids didn't play outside alone, especially near dusk. I swapped in new window locks and checked them twice each night. For a couple of weeks, nothing. No missing pets, no odd sightings. I started hoping Mr. Sue had spooked himself, fatigue and shadows playing tricks. Then came the evening that changed everything. The weather had warmed enough for the kids to play outside after dinner. Carrie was cleaning the kitchen. I was in my office finishing a few emails. The sun had slipped below the horizon, but a scrap of light still hung in the sky. Maybe 6:30, 7 o'clock. Carrie screamed. Not a startled yelp. A raw, primal scream. I knocked over my chair and ran. By the time I reached the front door, we had our youngest clutched tight and was herding the other two toward the house. Inside, now, she said, breathless. What is it? What happened? I scanned the yard, pulse hammering, wondering what was going on. She pointed to the tree line. At first, I couldn't make out anything. Then my eyes adjusted. I thought what I was looking at was a very large coyote. We get them every now and then, but they usually avoid the houses. But this one was bigger than any coyote I'd ever seen, and it was standing up on two legs. It stood about 50 yards away, balanced at the edge of our yard light. It had the shape of a wolf for an oversized dog, narrow muzzle, thick fur, but it stood upright on legs bent wrong, like a dog's hind legs forced to hold a human stance. The front limbs hung long, past where knees should be, ending in elongated, heavy paws. It was perfectly still, its head tipped slightly, as if considering us. The only movement was the slow lift and fall of its chest. My voice came back in a thin thread. Inside, now, I repeated their mother. I backed toward the door, unwilling to turn my back on it. I needed to know what it was doing and where it was going. Once everyone was in, I slammed and locked the door, then tore through the house, checking every latch and window. Mr. Sue's story about the crank window kept replaying in my head. If something had opened his, I wasn't leaving ours to chance. What was that? Carrie kept asking. What was that? I don't know, I said, because that was the only honest thing I could say. I don't know. I called the sheriff. A deputy arrived about an hour later. By then, whatever it was had gone. He took our statements and didn't seem bothered. Probably a coyote, he said. Mange can make them look odd. Sometimes they can stand up on their back legs. And poor lighting sure plays tricks on people. I wanted to argue, to tell him what I'd seen wasn't any mangy coyote, but I swallowed that. Sounding unhinged to a cop in a quiet community isn't exactly a great plan. And the look I'd seen in Mr. Sue's eyes told me he already knew. The next day, I drove to the houses with kids and repeated the warning, this time with urgency. No children outside alone, especially at dawn or dusk. No pets left out after night. Lock everything. The neighborhood pulled together. Some of the men formed small hunting parties, 4 or 5 guys with rifles and spotlights, but they didn't find anything. One neighbor's oldest son swore he saw eyes reflecting light one night, too high off the ground for any normal animal. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. There weren't any more missing pets. I didn't see any more shapes at the edge of the yard. Spring slid into summer, and life drifted back toward normal. But most folks stayed more cautious than they were before. Kids played in groups. Pets slept inside. No kid was left unattended outside. We all kind of kept an eye on each other's kids after that. 13 years have drifted by since that. Our oldest is in college now, the other 2 in high school. We're still in the same house, though many of our old neighbors have moved. Mr. Sue passed in 2015 and his wife relocated to Oregon to be near their daughter. Sometimes I tell myself we overreacted, that a natural predator cut through with odd habits and then moved on. Maybe it was a mountain lion with strange preference. Maybe the thing Carrie and I saw that night was just a diseased coyote with a posture that fooled us in the half-light. But then I remember how it watched my children. That wasn't the empty stare of a wild animal. It looked patient, and intelligent. I still do a lap of the windows before bed, and when the coyotes start up in the distance, I listen for a tone that's just a shade off. Something a little too low, a little too intent, because whatever came through our town in 2009, I don't believe it was just hunting dinner. I think it was hunting something else, and I'm afraid that one day it might find a reason to return. I remember the summer of 1992 like it was last week, even though everything since then has shifted under my feet. I'd just turned 27, still coasting on the last glow of being young, but also aware that it was time to grow up if I wanted a steadier life. I was based in northern Illinois, close enough to Wisconsin line that a wrong turn could put me across it, working as a traveling sales rep for a small office supply outfit. My days were highways and handshakes, pitching pencils, reams of paper, and staplers to store managers. Not glamorous, but it paid my rent and left a little for weekends with friends. That summer, corporate life gave me a new route to push deeper into the central of Wisconsin. It was miles of farmland, twisting blacktop that tunneled through pine stands, and small towns sprinkled far apart like distant porch lights. At first, I was excited for the change of scenery. I'd spent my life near the city. Rolling hills and dark woods sounded like a nice switch. Plus, I'd have the territory to myself. Fewer rival reps, better odds of making quota. One warm night in late July, I loaded my sky blue Ford Escort with a multi-day loop. I tossed a duffel into the trunk beside a huge black trash bag of used clothes my aunt had handed me. I promised to drop them off at Goodwill. She did her decluttering in bulk, and I was the courier. I'd meant to drop the bag already, but I'd let it ride around a bit too long. By the time I finally hit the road, there was the smell I couldn't quite place. Stale and sour, like old gym clothes that got damp. I figured I'd sort it out soon and ignore it. The sun was loud that day, painting the fields in orange and gold. I cracked the windows to let the air move and cranked the cassette deck. I'm pretty sure Madonna was on when a faded road sign for a country diner slid into view. I pulled in for meatloaf and mashed potatoes. The place was nearly empty. An older couple chatted with me about how quiet it was out here. Hardly any traffic at all. The man joked, "More animals than people most nights. Watch the big ones after dark." I chuckled, paid the bill, and didn't give it another thought. I left there around 7, aiming to make my motel by nightfall. The highway got lonelier by the mile. Trees pressed close, shadows long and thick as the sun sank. I hummed and steadied myself, because beneath the postcard scenery there was a faint itch of uneasiness. It was hard to imagine anyone choosing to be this far away from everything. Maybe 30 minutes later, something moved at the edge of my vision. The right side, just beyond the ditch. I eased off the gas, scanning under the branches. For a heartbeat, I caught a shape. Canine somehow, but upright. Too tall. My brain scrambled for a label. A bear? A big dog balanced funny? Then eyes flashed in the fading light and a cold ripple went through me. I pressed down on the accelerator, wanting distance. A few minutes on, I checked the rear view and saw a dark form dart across the road behind me. Maybe the same thing. Maybe not. But whatever it was fast, low, and gone in a blink. Keep going, I told myself. It's wildlife at dusk, that's all. And then twilight bled into full night. The moon was up, sometimes veiled by drifting clouds so the road fell into pockets of black. That's when I saw it again. This time running parallel to my car, deeper in the trees but keeping pace. I pushed the Escort harder. 60 wasn't much, but it was what the little engine had. The figure stayed with me, slipping in and out between trunks. I could hear branches giving way, dry snaps and heavy thuds, like something powerful was plowing through the understory. There was no pretending anymore. Something big was racing me in the dark. I don't know how long it lasted. Seconds that stretched like rope, or maybe minutes that felt like an hour, until the woods opened and a clearing appeared. The shape fell back and vanished. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been strangling. My hands were slick on the wheel. I tried to talk myself down. Wolf? Oversized coyote? But in my gut I knew. Bigger, more upright, too intentional. The gas station appeared at a crossroads under a jittery neon sign. A little island of light. I pulled in to steady my nerves. Inside, a teenage clerk watched me mop my forehead with a napkin. I asked for directions and whether anything large roamed these woods. He shrugged. Bears sometimes, nothing else that big. I didn't press it. I already felt like a city kid jumping at shadows. Back on the highway, I fixed my sights on the next rest area. The road was emptier than ever. Only the rare set of oncoming headlights caught my gaze. The rancid smell crept back into the cabin. It had to be the clothes in the trunk, but then I'd convinced myself something in there had spoiled. I decided I'd dump the bag if the rest stop had a dumpster, whatever it took to be rid of that stink. Just before 10, I rolled onto a lonely turnout. A couple of vending machines, battered picnic tables, one tired street lamp flickering overhead, cracked in the asphalt. The plan was straightforward. Toss the bag, splash water on my face, and move on. But the moment I stepped out, something stirred at the edge of the light. Low shapes along the tree line. Big. Even crouched. Very big. My heart kicked. I hurried to the trunk, fumbling the keys. When the lid popped, the smell slapped me. Wet clothes and something worse. But then I heard footfalls. Heavy. One to my left, one to my right. Like they were bracketing me. I spun, trying to see in the dim light. 2 pairs of eyes caught the street lamp glow. They were low and unblinking. My mouth went dry. I couldn't make out details, but the tall, dog-shaped silhouettes tucked in the brush weren't looking anywhere but at me. A broken little gasp slipped out as I yanked the black bag free, threw it over my shoulder, and staggered toward the nearest bin. But a growl rolled across the lot, too deep for any dog, too deep for any wolf. It was like a bass note that you feel in your ribs. Every instinct screamed, drop it and run. I heaved the bag into the dumpster and slammed the lid. Almost at once, the growling softened into a low, curious rumble. And then, sniffing. The realization punched through me. The smell had brought them in. I sprinted back to the car, hands shaking. Before I could climb in, a rough scratching skittered on the pavement behind me. Under that street lamp, a tall profile edged into view. What I was looking at looked exactly like a werewolf. Long muzzle, pricked ears, limbs bent at angles that didn't belong on a person. Dark fur caught the weak light, and I swear the fingers ended in hooked claws. I screamed, wrenched the driver's door open, and dove inside. My keys almost flew from my grip, but the engine turned. As I reversed, the headlights washed the lot, and the creature recoiled into the dark. But it wasn't alone. A second one, nearly as big, slipped back into the trees. 2 of them, moving together. Were they hunting? Were they scavenging? What in the hell were they? Adrenaline burned through me. I shot back onto the highway, forgetting every speed limit for the next 30 minutes. The rearview was a liar. Shadows twitching in shapes that weren't there. But once or twice, I thought I caught motion pacing the verge. The stink was gone with the bag, but the memory of it clung. If that smell drew them, what on earth had my aunt put in those clothes? Eventually, a tiny roadside motel appeared like a mercy. I checked in, glass-eyed, shaking, scared. The clerk watched me for a second and decided not to ask. In the room, I slid the chain and dragged a chair against the door. Sleep only came in scraps between listening for claws on the window. I sat up all night, thinking about what it was that I had seen. Was it a monster? Were they real? Was it something that I had imagined because I was tired? But no. The only thing that made sense was what was right there in front of my face. A wolf, walking on 2 legs, pacing me at some points, following me in others. Everything that I'd seen in movies, it was real. Morning sun made it easier to pretend that nothing happened. I finished my route and swore off lonely rest stops unless absolutely necessary. I still can't explain how those things kept pace in the timber, or how many they really were. Maybe it was a different one that I saw following me, and then there at the rest stop. I'll never know. But I'm convinced that they were attracted to the rot inside that bag. Whatever they were, I'm grateful that it didn't get me. And whatever was in that bag, I'm grateful that I dumped it when I did. If I had left it in the car, would those things have come to the motel too? And I learned something I never wanted to know. Rural Wisconsin isn't just cows and cornfields. There's something else on those back roads. If you drive them at night, keep your eyes on the tree line. Because the stories that you hear around here aren't just stories at all.